And I want to invite Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Bret Stephens to join me on the stage for our conversation. Bret, it's a delight to talk to you here.
It's nice to be back, Erica. Nice
Thank
to see you.
You're not wearing your honorary robes, but I assume they're in the closet.
I think you guys took them back.
That makes sense, that makes sense. So tell us a little bit more about the Bret Stephens Jewish story.
So, my standard joke is that I was raised as minimally Jewish as you can be without being functionally Unitarian. But it changed, and for a variety of reasons. So, first, a little bit of background. On my maternal side, a distant ancestor of mine was a very well-known Vilna rabbi named Grodzinski. But I come from the black sheep side of the family. And my great-grandfather, Israel Grodzinski, became Ivan Grodzinski until he was murdered by the Cheka, or I guess the NKVD, in 1918, which sent the family into flight, first to Berlin, until another political problem arose, and then the family fled again to Italy before the race laws. And so my mother was effectively a hidden child in World War II. After the war, part of the family went to Israel, and my mother came to the United States as a refugee, as a displaced person with her mother and $7 to her name. On my father's side, the family's from Kishinev and fled after the pogrom of 1903. And in the 1920s, my grandfather decided to change his name to the blandest Anglo-Irish name he could think of. And I always sort of admired the fact that it wasn't just Stephens, it was Stephens with a PH.
Really, we're brown. We weren't always brown either.
I mean, that's some chutzpah. So I was raised in this environment that was functionally non-Jewish, but intensely Zionist. And the first time I was in Israel was when I was 9. I spent a summer on a kibbutz at 15, but it was only, there are two sort of events in my adult life that were definitive. The first is when I was 19 years old, I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, which is a great, like yeshiva, a great school. And on a lark, I enrolled in a seminar on Genesis taught by Leon Kass, who is simply the greatest teacher I've ever had in my life. And I encountered Genesis in a secular way through a teacher whose erudition and depth made me understand that there was something here that demanded my respect, not for simply reasons of piety or my background, but that I was encountering a book that had profound claims on me as a sentient human being, as a thoughtful, searching person, and that the truth claims contained in Genesis were every bit as valid, and maybe, in a sense, even more so than what I had in the rest of my secular and fairly sophisticated education. That was a powerful, overwhelming experience. Leon Kass started out as a MD, PhD, and before becoming, I think, one of the great modern-day scholars of Genesis and Exodus. Then a few years later, I was a journalist working for the Wall Street Journal, and I was living in Brussels, and I started covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and flying out to Israel on a very regular basis. And 9/11 occurred. I happened to be in Israel on 9/11. And then I returned to Brussels a few days later when we could fly again, and I had this encounter with a lot of well-educated colleagues, peers in their late 20s, early 30s who worked in the various institutions of the European Commission and the Union, and the anti-Semitism that I overheard was stunning. I mean, effectively, a terrorist act conducted by an Islamist fanatic openly declared was being blamed on the state of Israel and, in effect, the Jews. So the ultimate culprit of 9/11, in the view of sophisticated people in the heart of Europe, was the Jews done it. And so the reason I participate, or I didn't participate, but I heard these conversations, was that with a name like Stevens, and as my friends tell me, a bit of a goyishy face, that they didn't think I was Jewish. So my grandfather's effort, oddly enough, in the 1920s to find his way out of his ancestral Jewish roots became my way into them. And shortly thereafter, I was invited to become the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, and
here we are.
Here we are.
And here we are. I want to thank you on behalf of all of the writing that you've done to combat anti-Semitism, to protect the state of Israel. You've been in the fray, and I wanted to think with you, because we talked about this is Passover and religious freedom and redemption, sort of putting your story within the larger story of religious freedom. If we understand religious freedom as a fundamental human right, and the first among rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution, to think, express, and act upon what you deeply believe according to the dictates of your conscience as is something essential to a diverse society. And yet democracy, which should offer the best platform for religious expression, has often flattened religious expression for people. Natan Sharansky talks about this at length in his book, Defending Identity. Why do you think that even though we can be proudly expressive of our religion, we're not, as a society?
Was that true?
It's not true in these few blocks.
Maybe that's true. No, but I guess I question the premise of the question. Look, this isn't France. We're not forced into a secular identity by virtue of the nature of the state. And when you get out of maybe not this corner of Manhattan, but other corners of Manhattan, you begin to realize that this is an intensely and proudly and diversely religious nation. It's just not noticed when you live in the pockets of the country that aren't that way.
Right.
Now, there is always going to be a conflict between the claims of identity and the claims of personal freedom. And I think no modern nation state has been able to navigate that conflict quite as well as the United States. And it's an area of obvious legal contestation at the Supreme Court. I mean, you can think of all kinds of cases where this comes up. The problem that I really have, and maybe this is closer to your question, is the way in which religion as a system of thought, as a form of creating moral human beings, how that has been gradually driven out of what you might call the higher tiers of culture at universities, in the kind of in the secular space, and that ultimately actually strikes me as deeply problematic for secular America, not religious America. Religious America is actually doing just fine, right? It's secular America that's finding that in one institution after another, they are being eroded from within because they don't have any concept of how you deal with the possibility, never mind competing truth claims, but the possibility of truth itself. And so, what are the institutions that are really in trouble in the United States? Actually, they're the universities.
Yeah.
So, not this university, but other universities. So I'm not sure how this is going to play out, but I think the United States remains a separate case. We just often don't see it because Manhattan south of 125th Street seems like a vast place.
Yeah, I guess I'm working with 2 Christian colleagues and 2 Muslim colleagues since 2019 on a concept called faith erasure and how people self-censor around faith within universities generally, secular universities. And it's sort of painful for people. It's almost a microaggression that's tolerated on campus, is sort of putting down people of faith. And that's become quite pernicious.
On the faith, but yes.
Yeah, it depends on the faith and depends on the university.
Yeah.
It's interesting to talk to students. I know that you've talked a lot about identity politics and campuses as, quote, zones of ideological intimidation instead of zones of thoughtful free expression. So we're here on a storied campus, what President Berman likes to call the flagship Jewish university, and you didn't fail us, you used that expression today. How can a university like Yeshiva University respond to this ideological intimidation?
Well, I mean, you'd have to tell me, I suspect that's not going on here in the way that it might be at other campuses. Look, I once heard Salman Rushdie make a comment which stayed with me. He said, universities need to be safe places for thought, not safe places from thought. And being a safe space for thought requires a certain kind of boldness and a certain kind of courage. Above all, the courage to accept that your foundational ideas can be aggressively challenged in a spirit of good faith, open inquiry, and having the confidence, 2 kinds of confidence. A, that your core convictions can survive those challenges, but even perhaps the deeper confidence that if they don't survive those challenges, you're capable of changing your mind. And the mark of educated people has always been, to me, this not conviction, but this inner tension between a kind of deep self-assurance and radical self-doubt, right? And maintaining, like, as if it were a rubber band between these, always having that strain is what strikes me as the creation of the thoughtful human being. It's a very hard thing to do. We all know people who are absolutely certain of their beliefs, and they're pompous bores who lecture you, and there are people who, having no beliefs or no sense that they're able to defend them, kind of collapse into a kind of neurotic intellectual insecurity. So how do you maintain this steady strain between these 2 ideas? That, I think, is the goal of every educational institution, to say, what you think could be wrong, let's test it. And let's become excited about the way in which we test those ideas. That's actually at the heart of what I think of as dynamic liberalism. And I don't mean liberalism as in, like,
Political philosophy.
Nancy Pelosi. Right. I mean, like, I mean liberalism in the classic sense of the term. That combination of things, and I think that's what universities at their best do. It's certainly what the University of Chicago did.
Yeah, and in fact, I was thinking about it because in one of your pieces, you described University of Chicago as an exercise in interrogation.
Yes.
And you said that every great idea is really just a spectacular disagreement with some other great idea, and that to disagree well, you must first understand well. And I love this so much. And you said you have to read deeply, listen carefully, watch closely, grant your adversary moral respect, and you need to allow the possibility that you might yet be persuaded of what he has to say. Are we doing enough of that in higher education? I mean, I could take you to the Beit Midrash, the study hall, a block away, and you'll see a lot of argumentation and conviction. We have a Yiddish expression, you don't die from a question. How do you tell other people in the world that?
You know, it's extremely difficult. The great physicist Wolfgang Pauli, Jewish and Austrian, I guess appropriate to what was said before, once reproached a student. He said, you're not even wrong. And if you ask your 3-year-old what's 2 + 2, and she says banana, that's not even being wrong. It's not even in the category of right. Sometimes I read comments to my columns at the New York Times, and I think, you're not even wrong, right? Because you're not even responding to what I have said. You're responding to an idea of what I've said. And the reason you're doing that is that to you, Bret Stephens is a caricature about whom you have a narrative, and you haven't bothered to read the words on the page. You're simply moving directly to caricature. So first of all, it begins by demanding of people that you read what is said, that you have an encounter with the statement, the thought, the idea itself. I don't think universities are managing to do this, because for so many universities today, it's not about what the text is, it's about what the narratives are, right? So the immediate result of this move from deep textual analysis, which is one of the great glories of Jewish civilization, to sort of thinking in terms of narratives and meta-narratives, is that we've deprived our students, not here, but elsewhere, we've deprived our students of the joy of reading and reading deeply. And again, this gets back to the University of Chicago and the program I did there, which was really a kind of a great books program. What happens when you really sort of read the encounter between, it was something I said?
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Between Aristotle and Plato. It's not that Aristotle misunderstands what Plato is saying. Aristotle understands Plato better than Plato understood himself, just as Locke understood Hobbes better than Hobbes understood himself, and on and on. And you have this, the grand narrative of Western civilization is this series of debates, but they're debates that rest, first of all, on profoundly understanding what it is that you're dealing with. And I think the poverty of modern education is that people don't understand what it is they're actually dealing with. I'd be happy to be told I'm wrong, I'm an idiot, that's fine. I probably am wrong, I probably am an idiot, but at least understand what it is that I'm trying to say. And that's where I think we have fallen down, and that's where I think the Jewish contribution to Western civilization, that belief, the deep engagement with text, is what makes us thoughtful, engaged, intelligent individuals capable not only of holding views but of challenging them, including our own. That's what should be happening here.
Yeah, and that's the biblical tradition. You have Abraham taking God on. You have Moses doing the same thing. You have the rabbinic tradition of argumentation, and the love of argumentation and the value. So I have to ask you a question. You read the comments section. Many of the journalists that I learn with,
no, that's not true.
They say they don't read it.
They're lying.
They're lying. So why do you read it?
Jewish self-loathing, I guess. No, really. It's sort of this kind of astounding. Look, it's my chances of encountering. I now, whenever I speak to most of my my audiences, my joke is I write for the newspaper to which all of you used to subscribe, right? So I don't really have. Probably true.
We still subscribe.
I don't have an opportunity in the way that I did at the Wall Street Journal to encounter my audiences beyond what's being said. And look, it is useful to take a hard look at what your hardest critics have to say and ask yourself, well, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I overstated. There is a kind of power and utility to that experience. The best kind of criticisms are when someone takes the time to write entire rebuttals to my argument. So at least there's a train of thought. Part of the problem we have is that we have algorithms. We've become a society in which all our algorithms are designed for maximum stupidity, right? And that's what Twitter is. Yeah. Twitter is a way of compressing you to your very worst, dumbest, and most obnoxious self. And that's become our new public sphere. one of the things that's interesting, I'm getting a little far afield from things here.
Go far afield, we love
So
it.
one of the things that I do at the Times is I have this conversation with my lovely colleague, Gail Collins. And she's liberal, I'm conservative, and we go at it, but it's called The Conversation, and it's like a game of tennis in which the whole idea is just to keep the ball in the air. We're not trying to score aces. If you look for our conversation on social media, it's nowhere. And yet it's one of the most wildly popular features in the paper. And we know this because we collect all the data. And why is it popular? Because what people want, which is actually an exchange of ideas, an interplay between different voices, that need is still there. It's just that we've created all of these technologies that try to suppress it. And it doesn't have to be that way. And you can create zones of conversation at universities, in your shul, in all kinds of ways that push that that social media outrage machine to one side, but it requires genuine effort.
Yeah. So, let's get out of the comment section beneath and the comment section sort of above and talk a little bit about cancel culture. You've written extensively about cancel culture. You've faced the brunt of it yourself. No doubt you've thought about the relationship.
I almost got canceled for stuff I said here once.
Really?
Yeah, it's a long time ago.
Oh, that's fun. Let's talk about that. So you wrote, quote, identity politics have become the moated castle from which we safeguard our feelings from hurt and our opinions from challenge. It's our safe space, but it's a safe space of a uniquely pernicious kind. How are we going to put an end to cancel culture?
I think cancel culture is going to put an end to itself the way the French Terror put an end to itself. The French Terror ended very swiftly when Robespierre's, the chief of cancel culture circa 1792, had his own head cut off. Obviously, I'm not talking about this literally, but eventually the cancelers, one of the things you kind of notice is that a lot of the people who used to be the galatiers of cancel culture on social media always end up with their own.
Yeah, something always happens, and then they get canceled.
To them, and then they go, "Oh, gee, this is really so very awful." And entire industries are destroying themselves right now. Not just media, but the publishing industry is destroying itself by becoming infatuated with cancel culture. Right now, the only books that are being published are books nobody wants to read, right? And the authors that people really want to read, like, say, J.K. Rowling, are in the process of being canceled. Of course, they're not actually being canceled. They're simply moving away from established institutions, publishing houses, media, and forming their own things. And one of the blessings of technology is that something different like Substack is allowing someone like my friend and former colleague Barry Weiss to go and, she wasn't canceled, but to go and do her own thing. The problem with cancel culture isn't really the cancellations. Actually, the cancellations are relatively few and far between. I mean, you read about them, they happen. The problem with cancel culture is the culture. And what I mean by that is, say tomorrow I get fired for
this conversation?
For this conversation, okay?
That will be terrible.
My life would go on.
But
right?
you always have a place here at Yeshiva University.
My life would thank you. I might, let's talk on Monday. My life would go on. I'd basically be okay. It would be, upsetting. But it means that there's a whole group of people who think, I should not say X, Y, and Z because I saw Bret Stephens say X, Y, and Z, and look what happened to him. And so it's the kind of pervasive quality of keeping your mouth shut, keeping your thoughts to yourself, the whisper networks that suddenly have kind of come up in which everyone knows like you're part of a conversation that 10 years ago would have been a totally reasonable conversation, and now is something that you kind of only will discuss with a trusted other person who you feel is not pressing the record button on their phone or is going to abuse a confidence 2 or 3 or 4 years later. And so this is, I think, really what is doing grave damage to us. You know, we talk about science as a process of trial and error, right? You have to make mistakes in science in order to find better paths. You know, all thought is a process of trial and error. You have to be able to think out loud, right? You have to be able to speak in order to find your way to think. And in doing so, you're going to say things that are probably stupid and foolish. Lord knows I've said millions of things that are stupid and foolish. Many of my readers think it's a weekly occurrence.
You're doing okay right now.
But you have to do that, and I'm not talking really about so much me, but so younger people in this audience, in order to arrive at better thinking. And that's really...
Right, it's the iterative process.
It's an iterative process of saying dumb things and say, well, it's not quite that. Let's go back. Well, we're removing that, and what we're telling young people is come up with a bunch of politically correct shibboleths, mouth them incessantly, and you'll be safe. You'll be okay. Your careers won't be derailed. I think that's genuinely the toxic side of cancel culture. All the people who are prominently canceled, with a few exceptions, their lives move forward.
So you created your own platform. You created Sapir, which is a wonderful journal, and encourage everyone to...
I even brought a show and tell.
Here's a show and
really
tell.
Exists with her piece in it.
Thank you. So tell us a little bit about Sapir, how people can get Sapir, what you were trying to do with it.
So I was approached by the Maimonides Fund a little over a year ago. They said, we're looking to do a journal to sort of talk in a more prescriptive way about Jewish issues, and we're thinking of maybe putting together 14 or 15 essays on a variety of topics. Would you help us edit? I said, if you just do one, it's a flash in the pan. Why don't we do around four major Jewish themes? And the ones I had in mind were social justice, power, continuity, and aspiration. They said, great, let's do that. And what we found was that the response was really electric. I had a couple of lodestars. One, again, was I didn't want simple diagnosis. There are a lot of Jewish publications that are like, here's the problem, everyone hates us, hunker down, you know, and pray for a better future. I wanted thoughtful people to say, as you did, here's a solution. Here's how we move from the problem to a brighter Jewish future. So really the subtext of Sapir is ideas for a thriving Jewish future. The second thing I insisted is I wanted voices with whom I did not agree, both in terms of a religious perspective and in terms of a political one. So I wanted to get Benny Morris, for example, or Yehuda Kurtzer, Anshel Pfeffer, voices well to my left, a few to my right, because a lot of Jewish literary culture tends to be narrowly ideological. Like commentary has a lane, dissent has a lane, commentary and dissent merged, they became dysentery. That's an old Woody Allen joke. And I wanted just to say, okay, look, if we're going to have a Jewish conversation, it just can't be, you know, people singing from the same song sheet. So that was the other aspect. And the third thing is I said, I don't want, if more than 5,000 people are reading this, it's a total failure. A total failure. I want this to be...
Don't subscribe.
Don't subscribe.
Even though it's free.
Yeah.
And you can get it online.
The idea is if it's on everyone's coffee table, they're not going to read it. If they've heard about it, maybe they'll think, gee, how do I get a hold of that? So here's a job for, I see the incoming editor-in-chief of your student paper. Here's a job, find Sapir online. That's my assignment for you.
Okay, find Sapir online. Well, it is wonderful, and I do hope that more than 5,000 people read it. I think it's fresh and it's different, and it's a pleasure to have all of those voices in conversation on the page. I want to talk a little bit about Israel, because that's the your next is on Zionism. Your next and You said in a recent interview that you don't think there's a future for American Jewry in the absence of a secure and prosperous Jewish state. You've also often quote the fact that Israel is the 11th on the list of world's happiest places.
Yes.
So tell us why what the significance of Israel is in terms of American Jewish prosperity, and what do you think Israel needs to do to get even higher on that list?
Of happiness.
Of happiness.
I don't think
Why settle for 11?
I don't think it can go to number 1 because it wouldn't be Jewish if it
Right.
if there weren't some
Well,
large
let's say number
quotient of complaint. Look, we talk constantly about Jewish continuity, and I did the math recently. There are 8.6 million Americans who had or have at least one Jewish parent. There are 4.3 million Americans who are not only Jews, but are Jews of some religion. That's to say, they're clearly within the fold. So just in the last generation, half of American Jewry either has moved away or is in the process of moving away. 60% of Jewish marriages in the last 10 years have been with a non-Jewish partner. Now, it is absolutely true that some of those partners, like my wife, become converts and you expand the fold. It's also true that some large percentage, we don't know exactly how many, are slowly moving away. And if you think of the story of ethnic life in America, there was once a thriving, religiously and linguistically distinct Swedish-American community. It had newspapers, it had a culture. Where is it now? Doesn't exist. If you think of religions in the United States, where are the Puritans or their descendants, the Congregationalists? They don't exist. So the challenge of ethnic life in America has always been to be a people slightly apart, right? Not radically apart, but slightly apart. And that's a very difficult tightrope on which to walk. It's in some ways remarkable that American Jews haven't almost wholly fallen off, except in the most religiously observant, tight-knit communities. And I think a large part of the reason is the restoration of the state of Israel has created a fountainhead. I don't mean that in a Randian sense, just a fountainhead of not just Jewish pride, but a locus of vibrant Jewish civilization. And I think that has absolutely transformed the nature of Jewish life in the world. It's not simply a matter of having a secure or reasonably secure homeland restoration to our roots. It's the fact that Israel is generating culture. It's generating ideas. It's generating thoughts about what it means to participate, not just in the religion, but in the civilization itself, which is a larger idea than religion. And I don't see world Jewry having any hope except as a very marginal, Zoroastrian or something, very small religious group, absent the creation of the state of Israel, either because Jews face the risk of assimilation, or in other contexts because they face the growing risks of anti-Semitism. And both things are alive today. So it's one of the things that has made me feel a profound sense of, I'm looking for the right verb, a profound sense of solidarity and devotion and pride in what the state of Israel is. And I say this, by the way, everyone says Bret Stephens never criticizes the state of Israel. I criticize it plenty. I don't know a Jew who doesn't criticize the state of Israel, right? But it is the basic core of it, the restoration of a nation to its homeland and the creation of a state, a place among the nations as well as a light unto the nations, which I think is one of the great historic achievements of human civilization. I don't just mean of Jewish civilization, of human civilization. It's absolutely incredible.
It is. Thank you. You were raised in Mexico. You mentioned about being the grandchild of European refugees. We're all thinking about the refugee crisis. You know, these wonderful students who joined us in doing something. And, you know, sometimes when you do something, it feels like nothing. I share that feeling of leaving, knowing that refugees, that we were there and left, and refugees are staying for some extended period of time. I'm not asking you to make a prediction now that we're on the other side of the world, but I kind of am. What do you think is going to happen in the war in Ukraine?
Oh, I hate these. I always love being asked about 100-year predictions because then you'll all be dead when you judge the prediction. Okay, so again, with the caveat that I could be wrong and we have limited knowledge, I think this war is going to go on for a while. I don't think Vladimir Putin is going to give up easily. I think the idea that he has been at least defeated or pushed back in Kiev is obviously great news. The Russians were pushed back in Grozny and then came back in a way that was dismal and terrifying. I think the Russian play has always been, let's try to take all of it if we can, but if we get the energy-rich and then Russian-rich, as in ethnic Russian-rich portions of Ukraine, that's a victory unto itself. I think there's a lot of premature triumphalism in the West based on Russia's military reversals. I don't think the sanctions are going to have the effect that we would like them to have because Germany and other countries are still buying hundreds of millions of euros of Russian gas and oil every single day. And I also think that this is not a pleasant thought. I think we are in the early stages of a kind of World War III. And what I mean by that is if you think about World War II was the conjoining of disparate conflicts around the world. There was a Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Okay, that's one conflict there. And then an Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935. And then a German invasion of Czechoslovakia in 38 and 39 and an Anschluss. So World War II didn't start. Everyone says, when did World War II start? People say, well, September 1st, 1939. No, World War II accumulated and gathered. And so we have this war in Ukraine. It's vital that we do everything we can to defeat Vladimir Putin without igniting a thermonuclear war. Because soon we're going to have a conflict in Taiwan, especially if Russia has major gains in this war. We are looking at a looming, massive, multi-power conflict in the Middle East over Iran's impending nuclearization. And what I fear is going to be a catastrophically misjudged new nuclear deal, which is going to set other balls in motion. And it's happening at a time when we have not only persistent inflation in the country, but overheated markets throughout the system. So bring these kind of geopolitical crises together with the possibility that the United States could very abruptly go into some kind of steep recession or even depression. And that just smacks of the 1930s. So people should be alarmed.
Okay. I mean, I think we're all alarmed. I think we're all reading with a note of despair. It's just not where I want to end.
But can I offer another thought?
Please.
So let me ask the more specific question, which is, where should Israel be in the Ukraine conflict? And there's been a lot of commentary on the constraints under which Israel operates because you have a Russian Air Force that dominates Syrian airspace. It's a vital Israeli interest that it should be able to destroy Iranian installations, Hezbollah, the same thing, installations in Syria. And Israel has taken a notably less than forceful moral path. And I would just sort of indulge the following thought exercise. In 1948, when Harry Truman was confronted with the question of the recognition of the State of Israel, it was opposed by his Secretary of State, George Marshall, whose prestige was unrivaled. It was opposed by his defense secretary, James Forrestal. It was opposed by the CIA, all for perfectly sound strategic reasons. The Arabs had the oil. The Arabs were probably going to win the war. And by the way, the Middle East was going to be a zone of contestation between the United States and the Soviet Union in the incipient Cold War. Why would the United States want to get on the side of these 600,000 Jews who were going to lose anyway against many millions of Arabs on whom we had with whom we had strategic interests? And Truman made partially a political decision, but I really think, having read a number of his biographies, I think a moral decision that the United States had an absolute moral obligation to stand with the State of Israel, that it was simply the right thing to do. And it was informed by whether it was his partner, haberdashery partner from Kansas City, or whatever it was, he had this moral instinct that he would recognize the State of Israel. And it turns out in the fullness of time that the best Middle Eastern decision the United States ever made was to be an ally of Israel against its enemies. It was a strategically wise decision. It just didn't seem so at the time. So the way I put this is that for Truman, he allowed his values, his moral values, to define his strategic interests. He did not allow his strategic interests to define his moral values. And I think it's imperative now that Israel, as the beneficiary of that kind of thinking by Harry Truman 74 years ago, should also have a foreign policy in which Israel's core values ultimately define its interests. Israel can do just fine against the dilapidated Russian Air Force in Syria, should it come to that. The correlation of forces, which is a concept that Vladimir Putin understands very well as an ex-KGB agent, are not on his side, is not on his side in the Middle East. But I think Israel has an obligation not just to the Jews of Ukraine, not just to the free world in whose orbit Israel exists, but to our core values as Jews, to stand up for President Zelensky, for the Ukrainian people in the face of this barbarity and the horror. Those Ukrainians could just as easily be us, and we should do everything we can to assist them, whether they're Jews or not Jews. That should be at the heart of Israel's national interest.
Thank you. So we're at the end of our hour. It's been a pleasure talking to you. We thank you for coming here. Any closing thoughts, something that you're feeling hopeful about?
I do, actually, and they're really directed to the students in the audience, and it's that you discover too late in life that the world was once your oyster.
This sounds like a commencement speech.
No, it's not. I'm just coming up with it as on the spot. But you have possibilities when you're young that you don't have later on. You just tend not to realize it until they're well past you. But if you're young, I mean, I've sort of painted this grim scene. World War III is upon us, and there's cancel culture, and there's seemingly, deep political and economic issues in the country, and deep social issues and cultural issues affecting Jews. But first of all, I don't think any pessimist in history ever won a moment, won a day, started a movement, or changed the world. But what we need are kind of thoughtful realists, and people who are able to contend with a variety of ideas with a destination in view. And that destination ought to be, for this audience, ought to be a thriving Jewish future. A thriving Jewish future. So what I hope you do is you bend your efforts to making that a thriving Jewish future. And let me add one more thing. Not just a thriving Orthodox future, a thriving future for the entire Jewish community, secular, religious, Reform, conservative, Orthodox, whatever, that everyone, every Jew in America should feel at some level, whatever their observance, that they're participating in this extraordinary civilization, in this extraordinary opportunity to renew ourselves and do great things, not just for Jews, but for the world at large. And I think that's, like, I'm looking at you guys over there, and some of you over there, that's really your moment and your opportunity. And it's, I feel nothing but envy that it's yours to do and not so much ours.
So, President Berman opened and he talked about Jews as fighters, people who fight and people who inspire. And I'd like to thank you for doing both of those things on behalf of all of us.
Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Wishing you all a delightful Passover and a future as thoughtful realists.